beginning. A plan that's inalterable for him. And Jesus' sacrifice wasn't an afterthought. We've heard some in history lately saying that, well, God didn't really intend for Jesus to die. You know, if you listen to other religions, other faiths, they will tell us, yep, Jesus was set on earth for a purpose, but he failed. Things didn't go right. God didn't intend for him to die. Except that Scripture teaches us different. This guy Paul that we're now studying said this: but when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem the very people that lived under the law, that we all might receive adoption as God's children. Because you are his children, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father, or Daddy. Very familiar terms. So that by God, you are no longer a slave, but a child. And since you are his child, then you are an heir to his kingdom. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a wayward plan. It was God's purpose from the beginning. And it was deliberate, done with foreknowledge, as Acts says. He was handed over by you, or to you, by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him on the cross. God handed him over. We didn't seize him. We didn't pull him out of his plan. God handed him over. Why? So that in that sacrifice, we might be born anew. So what does all this have to do with this man, Paul? Well, let me give you a little bit of his history. In Acts 22, verse 3, Paul, in defending himself, primarily to other Christians, says this: I am indeed a Jew. In other words, he's standing on that heritage. He says, don't judge me because somehow I'm an outsider. I'm one of you. I was born a Jew. I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. Now that would be modern-day Turkey. I was brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the greatest rabbis of the time, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and I was zealous toward God, as you all are today. In other words, this man Saul at the time was kind of the valedictorian of his class. He was the top of the top. He had all the right credentials. Anything he wanted to do within the synagogue, anything he wanted to do within the Jewish community, there for his taking. And so when all of a sudden this upstart group starts to take root, called the Way, we know them as Christians. When all of that starts happening, who do they turn to? Well, they turn to Saul. Why? Because he knows the law better than anyone else. And he's got the determination. And he's got the background. And he's a Roman citizen. So he can get away with a whole lot more than some of the others can. All of these things were put in place by God. And all of them seem detrimental to God. But they're not. Let's give it a little bit more. Saul spoke Greek because he was a Roman citizen. He spoke Hebrew because he was Jewish. He was a Roman citizen. He was born a Jew, and that gave him kind of dual citizenship in a world that valued that kind of diversity. He was a tent maker by trade. In fact, it's speculated that many of the tents that he made, we use tent-making ministries, meaning, well, you've got some other job while you're preaching. Well, in Paul's day, when you had a tent-making ministry, it meant you sewed tents. You made these portable dwellings. And who did he make them for? Probably the Roman soldiers. So he's making tents for the very Romans who later on are becoming his enemy. Now, as a missionary, Gary would know this, he had all the tools that he needed. He had cultural familiarity with the region. He knew all of the people and the background and the language. He had all the linguistic skills. He had the documents to travel. In other words, he had dual passports. He could travel through Hebrew countries, and he could also travel through the Greek-speaking countries, and that encompassed most of the world. He had a side trade in order to support his missionary endeavors. He made tents. So he was kind of the ideal missionary, and that's why Paul, this former Saul, becomes known as probably the greatest missionary of all times. On top of that, he learned the rabbinic trade. In other words, he learned to be a pastor. He learned to be a teacher. One of the things I found interesting was that Paul and Jesus were probably close to the same age. And the way that they figure that is that Paul, it says, was part of the Sanhedrin. And he had to be 30 years old or greater to be part of the Sanhedrin. And at the time that he was part of the Sanhedrin would have meant that he was probably about 33, 34 years old, which was shortly after Jesus' crucifixion at the age of 33. So it's highly likely that when Jesus is a 12-year-old little boy in the temple with his father at the feet of all these rabbis teaching them, that one of the students there is Paul. Now, whether or not Jesus took notice of Paul, whether he saw him or not, God certainly did. And God prepared him for all of the things that he needed to do later on. God gave Paul education. He gave him a vocation. And he gave him all the documentation that he needed in order to do all of this missionary work. So who better to present Jesus as the fulfillment of the law than probably the law's greatest scholar of its time, Saul? Did God make a mistake? I don't think so. Did it look like a mistake? Well, certainly to those that God initially sent Saul to, these Christians who were going to surround him with the knowledge of Jesus. How does one who has persecuted them, how does one who has taken their lives now become their greatest ally? Paul's choice of violence toward the way was probably his own waywardness. But as it says, God has a way of turning that around. I like to think of God as kind of this great martial arts expert. In my 2 or 3 classes that I took of judo when I was young, the only thing I remember of any of that is that judo is the art of turning your opponent's energy against themselves. I think Paul had that against him, and later on he's very adept at doing that against others. So when Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus, he is transformed from this very legalistic Saul, who knew the law, who knew all of the rabbinic teachings, and held to them with an iron fist, and anyone who didn't would be put to death. Jesus transforms this legalistic Saul into a missionary of grace and mercy called Paul. All things work together for good for those who love God. I want to share another very brief story in closing that Max tells about his own wife. He's a brave man.